Let's get started on Chapter 1, Introduction to Computer Networks. In this chapter, we will look at an overview of computer components. We will look at the fundamentals of network communication. We will look at network models, and we will look at networking terminology. Let's start on page 2, an overview of computer concepts. Let's look at the components of a PC, of a personal computer. And you might say, if this is a networking class, why are we studying the components of a personal computer? And the answer is that a local area network is composed primarily of interconnected personal computers. So to understand how a local area network works, it's important to understand the components of the individual computers. Personal computer hardware can be divided into 4 categories: input hardware, processing hardware, storage hardware, and output hardware. Here is the example. The user types in the data, such as 2 plus 2, and he presses the Enter key, and the 2 plus 2 goes to the processing hardware. The processing hardware adds the 2 plus 2, that's the processing, addition, and we get the number 4. Then the number 4 can be output to the monitor, which is output hardware, or the number 4 can be output to the printer, which is output hardware, or the number 4 can be saved to storage to the hard disk for future use. The system unit is also called the box, and it contains the processing hardware. If we take the top off the system unit, inside of the computer we will see the power supply, the hard disk, the DVD, and most importantly, the motherboard. The motherboard is a big plastic circuit board that sits flat on the bottom of the computer. And on the motherboard, we will see the microprocessor, RAM, the bus, and the BIOS. The microprocessor is a processing chip, and it's the only part of the computer that can add 2 plus 2. RAM stands for Random Access Memory, and it is current working memory. The bus are the little wires printed on the motherboard that allows data to flow from RAM to the microprocessor, back to RAM, and out to the slots. The slots, these white things on the motherboard, are called slots. After data has been processed, it can then be stored to a storage device such as a hard disk, DVD, or USB drive. A controller card is also known as an expansion card. It's also called an adapter card, and it's also called an I/O card. And a controller card is a circuit board about the size of your hand that plugs into a slot on the motherboard. And common controller cards include a video card, or a sound card, or a network interface card, which of course is particularly relevant to us. BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System, and it controls the boot process on the computer. The BIOS chip located on the ROM chip controls the boot process of the computer. And if we want to run BIOS setup, we turn the computer on, and then we press F2, or we press delete, or sometimes we have to press F10 while the computer is booting up, and this takes us to the BIOS setup screen. And in the BIOS setup, we can configure the time and the date and the boot order. The BIOS setup allows us to configure the time and the date and the boot order, and all that information is stored in CMOS, which stands for Complementary Metal Oxide Semiconductor, and thank goodness you don't need to know that for the exam. CMOS is simply a piece of RAM. and that is maintained by a battery which is about the size of a quarter, and the battery is located on the motherboard. If you find that the computer is losing its date and its time, it could be that you have a bad battery. Now, this is particularly important with servers because the authentication servers have to sync up with the international time server, and they have to sync up with each other. And if they're not in sync, then users can't get authenticated, which means they can't get logged on. So one little bad battery could prevent users from getting logged on because it could throw the time and date off in the authentication servers. So the hardware components of a microcomputer include input, output, processing, and storage hardware. And the system unit, or the box, contains the motherboard, and mounted on the motherboard is the microprocessor and RAM and the slots. Data can be stored to storage, such as the hard disk, and controller cards include video cards, sound cards, and network interface cards, and the BIOS controls the boot order. Now let's move to page 14, the fundamentals of network communication. Let's look at the hardware components of a local area network. A local area network is made up of a client, a server, a switch, cable, and network interface cards. The client is not the customer. The client is the computer. It is the workstation. The client is the workstation. And then the server is a big centrally located computer that everybody can save data to. A switch is a junction box that allows everyone to connect. The cable connects the switch to the network interface card, and there is a network interface card in every workstation and in the server. The network interface card is a circuit board that's about the size of your hand that plugs into slots in the motherboard. The network interface card plugs into slots in the motherboard, and here's a picture of a network interface card being inserted into slots on the motherboard. Or the network interface card could be built into the motherboard. The cable plugs into the network interface card, and it plugs into the switch. So if you don't have a network interface card, then you got nothing to plug the cable into. So the hardware components of a local area network are client, server, switch, cable, and network interface card. That's the hardware components. Now let's look at networking software. A local area network has clients and servers, and the software that controls the user's workstation is called the client operating system, and an example would be Windows 7 or Windows 8 or Windows 10. And then the file server has an operating system as well, and that's called a server operating system, or an NOS, a network operating system. And an example of a network operating system might be Windows 2012 server or Windows 2016 server. Network operating system runs the server, the client operating system runs the workstation. Note, network operating systems are covered in greater detail in Chapter 11. Networking protocols. A network protocol is a piece of software that allows computers to communicate, and TCP/IP is the most commonly used network protocol. Let's look at TCP/IP. If we go to our workstation and click on Start, and then select Control Panel, and then we select Network and Internet, and then we select Network and Sharing Center, on the left we can click on Change Adapter Settings, and if I select my network interface card, and I right-click and select Properties, we can see there it is, the TCP/IP protocol, TCP/IP/v4. And if we look at the description, we can see the Transmission Control Protocol / Internet Protocol is the default wide area network protocol that provides communication across diverse interconnected networks. If we look at the properties of TCP/IP, we can see this computer's IP address, which in this case is 10.0.0.2. An IP address is a number which is assigned to a computer, and we will talk about this later on in the course. Testing IP configuration. Two TCP/IP utilities that I would like to talk about are ipconfig and ping. ipconfig simply shows you the IP address of the computer where you are, and ping allows you to determine if you can communicate with other computers. To display the IP address of the computer where I am, I go to the command prompt and I type the ipconfig command and I press the enter key. And that shows me that my IP address for this computer is 10.20.12.206. That's the IP address of this computer. Now, ping allows you to send a signal out to another computer to see if that other computer is running. And if that other computer sends a signal back, then you know that the other computer is running and all the hardware between you and the other computer is good. To test communication to another computer, I go to my computer here and I type ping followed by the IP address of the computer I want to communicate with. I press the enter key and I see the other computer does reply. So this tells me that the other computer is up and running and all the hardware between me and the other computer is good. TCP/IP is a protocol that allows computers to communicate, and we will discuss TCP/IP in greater detail in chapters 5 and 6. Page 32 discusses networking models, peer-to-peer network, and a server-based network. And a peer-to-peer network is only used for a very small organization. In a peer-to-peer network, everybody is connected to each other using a switch, but there is no file server. And in a peer-to-peer network, anybody can connect to anybody else's hard disk. Well, this is not bad for a very small organization of only 2 or 3 people who know each other very well and who work very closely together, but it's not good for a large organization. Most organizations are going to use a server-based LAN, and a server-based LAN has a file server, and that is a central location where people can save their files, and that way many people can access the same file. They can work on the same project together, and the buzzword for this is collaboration. Collaboration is where many people are working on the same file and on the same project together, and a file server allows that. And in a server-based LAN, typically users cannot access each other's hard disk. In a server-based LAN, you will see that there are different types of servers. A file server is a separate computer that everybody can save data to. A print server is used when you don't want to buy a printer for each individual employee. You just get one good printer and everybody prints to the print server, and the print server pushes the job to that one good printer. A database server houses the company's database. A web server holds the company's web page. An application server holds the company's applications. In our case, the Community College of Baltimore County, that would be the student registration application. And of course, the email server holds the company's email. But probably the most important type of server is a domain controller. A domain controller is a login server, and it is also called an authentication server. Users log into the domain controller. The domain controller has Active Directory on it. And Active Directory is a database of usernames and passwords, and it's used for authentication. So users stand at their workstations, but they log into the domain controller. To be authenticated means to be logged in. To summarize network components, LAN hardware is composed of clients, servers, a switch, cable, and network interface cards. And network hardware includes client and server operating systems, as well as networking protocols, particularly TCP/IP. And in a server-based network, types of servers include file server, print server, and domain controller. In the next video, we will cover networking terms and communications between computers. And this concludes our summary of network components. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.